Last night there were a number of themes that came out fairly strongly. One of them, of course, is that trade policy has not yet figured as prominently as it should in the climate agenda, and that there's probably a lot of work to be done to get it right. There's nothing automatic in terms of getting trade policy right, and when we mix climate with development, that's a big challenge that needs a lot of thinking about still. And that came out, I think, fairly strongly from the presentations yesterday. Another theme that comes out strongly, I think, of course, we live in an interdependent world, and trade policy does not exist in a silo. Trade is intimately connected with issues of finance, it's intimately connected with issues around technology and technology transfer, and we need a holistic approach when it comes to policy making in the climate and development space, and that again makes for a more complicated discussion. It makes the scale of the challenge all the more demanding and difficult, but we need to think in that kind of holistic way if we're going to get the policy agenda right in terms of marrying the climate and the development agendas. And I think the third point that came out from the discussion yesterday was that the trading system right now is not in a particularly healthy place. Trade is not growing very quickly. It hasn't been growing very quickly since the global financial crisis, in fact. Tensions in the trading system are significantly high and troubling, and that makes it all the more difficult to find a kind of positive response. And I think in that context, and I think we need to recognize it, trust in the processes around discussions on international trade is pretty low at the moment. And again, that makes it all the more difficult to find collective responses to what is an increasingly demanding challenge. So the context in which we need to put trade into the climate agenda is a difficult context right now, but it's one that needs urgent and frank and hard thinking about. And I think we've got a panel, I hope, this morning that will be able to shed some light on the path we need to take forward. So I'm going to give each of the panelists a few minutes to reflect more generally on the nature of the interrelationship between trade policy, climate and development, and from their particular perspectives. And I'll introduce each of them in advance. And then I have some specific questions for each of the panelists once we've heard the initial presentations. So I think we will start with a 5 or 6 minute presentation with Carolyn Deer-Birkbeck, who is the Executive Director of the Forum on Trade, Environment and Sustainable Development Goals, right, Carolyn? Which is based at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. So, Carolyn, your opening remarks as to the nature of the challenge and the solutions, if you have any.
Great, thank you very much. So thank you for the introduction, and I'm really delighted to be part of this discussion today. This nexus of trade, climate and sustainable development is central to the work that we do at the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs in Geneva. And our very particular niche is trying to promote multilateral cooperation and action on this topic. So what I'm going to say today builds on what we have learned through some of our engagement with the diversity of governments represented in Geneva in the context of the multilateral trading system. So the first thing in our work, and it's a challenge we face every day, is how can we foster cooperation on climate and trade that's ambitious in terms of driving the climate action that we need to see at speed and at scale, but that is also fair for developing countries and addresses their long-standing development concerns and the long-standing trade-related challenges that they have in regards to development. So in our work, we see that it's a moment of high recognition of the links between climate and trade, but there's a huge amount of debate about how we go about that cooperation and how best to ensure that development concerns are addressed. We know, as Richard just said, that getting trade policy and cooperation right has been critical for development. We've known that for a long time, but it's also critically important that we get the climate and trade nexus right for development as well. So for developing countries, when we speak to them, they highlight that it's not just an issue of climate and trade for them, it's an issue of how to foster development that is climate resilient using trade, how to foster development that's climate friendly, and also that pushes them in a position to thrive and to generate sustainable development in their own economies. I always like to remind people at the beginning, it's not news here, but there's a diversity of developing countries. We tend to focus a lot in the news on some of the largest emerging countries, but there's enormous regional diversity, levels of development, different levels of climate vulnerability and trade circumstances. And all developing countries, like developed countries, face complex domestic political economy challenges when it comes to tackling sustainability issues. So we're all in the same boat in that regard, that everyone, all of the legislatures, leaders who are trying to push for changes and green transformation face similar challenges domestically. What's different, I guess, in developing countries is they face this in the context of a host of other intersecting crises, whether that's around debt crises, energy costs, water scarcity, food insecurity, issues of inequality and political instability, and for many just still recovering from the post-COVID crisis as well. So in our work, we hear a lot of concern from developing countries about many climate and trade initiatives and about their impacts, potential and perceived and real impacts on their development. But I think what's more interesting for me is how much we hear their willingness to engage and want to be part of agenda setting on a positive trade agenda that can drive action on climate and development in tandem. So it's not that they're in denial that the climate issues matter for trade and development, it's that they want to have a more constructive dialogue on how we advance that kind of cooperation in ways that address and factor in their development concerns. And that's in terms of the institutions and the policies that are charged with trade. So there are some important risks that we face if we don't take development priorities into account. The first is that we will end up with more trade disputes, geopolitical tensions, and trade barriers that will end up undermining the international cooperation that we need to see on climate action, that undermine the dialogue and the trust. We also risk undermining trade cooperation that we need to see in the long run. We need a trading system to work not just next year and in 2 years to drive some urgent climate action. We need it to work for the next several decades, because climate action will be ongoing for several decades. So we can't afford to undermine or pull apart the trading system in the process of climate action. We also risk undermining development commitments. If we undermine food systems that are needed and trade that's needed for food security, then that's bad for development and developing countries. If we fail to harness trade for the energy transition, that's also going to be harmful for developing countries. And it will also be harmful for developing countries if we put together a set of requirements and regulations that they cannot meet and they have no support to meet. So there's some real risks involved if we don't get this right. So just super fast, I'm going to run through what I think are 5 elements of a positive climate trade development agenda. The first thing is that we need to recognise that for many developing countries, mitigation is important. They have concerns and like developed countries about the need to drive down emissions. They want to do their part in that, but critically they face challenges of adaptation and of loss and damage that for many of the developing countries, especially those that are most climate vulnerable, are really, really important. And there are trade issues there that when we talk climate and trade, we often ignore. So for many countries, the climate crisis is having an immediate impact now on their productive sectors, their trade infrastructure, their participation in supply chains. And there's much that we can and should do with trade policy to address that. We can do some simple things, not simple, but we can do things like promote investment that would help developing countries to address specific adaptation challenges. We can have a discussion on balance of payment and trade crises arising from the climate, climate impacts, and we can also look harder at how we can help developing countries build the climate resilient infrastructure they need to participate in trade. So there's this adaptation and loss agenda, I think, is also something that warrants consideration in the trade arena as well. Second thing that developing countries talk about is the critical need for technologies, that they simply will not be able to compete in this green transition effectively if they don't have greater access to technologies. And here I think there are 4 issues. It's about the development of these technologies, their affordability, the diffusion, and also their uptake. So all of that requires a package of policies. It's not simply a matter of opening your markets. There's a whole set of industrial policies that need to accompany that in order to make technology actually be used, the cutting edge technologies be used. And also we need to think about how we can make developing countries be players in the development and in the supply chains for those technologies. We have ways of cooperating around government procurement, around intellectual property policies, around standards and so on that can help promote this cooperation around technologies. A third issue is that trade itself is critical to many developing countries. We have to remember that they don't want to be second-tier players in a green global economy. They don't want to be marginalized. They need to build their own capacity to participate in green value chains and so on. So this means we have to think about what we're doing also to promote their trading interests in this transition. So part of that is ensuring they have market access for sustainably produced food and agricultural products, that we cooperate on standards around that for them. We also address domestic support and tariff escalation that hampers market access opportunities for developing countries. We address environmentally harmful subsidies to those. So as we need to move urgently away from carbon-intensive trade, we also need to make sure that we're creating opportunities for developing countries in the trade and in the products that they can specialize in. And that includes opportunities for MSMEs, opportunities to really benefit from trade in critical materials, and also to harness their own potential to be players in renewable energy markets as well. So the fourth element is on sustainable investment and finance. I have never spoken to a developing country senior official who's not emphasized the critical role of investment in driving the green transition in their countries. So we need to do a lot more to try and support investment as a key part of this trade and climate agenda. Here we have to remember that whilst the US and to extent the EU and other major players are able to afford green industrial policies that are throwing millions and millions of dollars into the green transition, many developing countries don't have the fiscal space to do this. So we need to ensure that we're thinking of other ways that they have an enabling policy environment and access to the kind of finance and investment that they need in order to drive change and mobilize resources in their own economies. And then finally, I'll just close. The fifth element, I think, is that in order to promote cooperation and coordination on trade and climate, we need to think hard about the principles that underpin cooperation. And in our work, we've heard a lot of concern from developing countries about the proliferation of different trade-related climate measures. I think everyone agrees and understands we need to take measures. The question for them is how can we cooperate around their design and their implementation so that developing countries can also benefit more in this process. Their concern is not for the costs of this transition to be imposed upon them. They understand developed countries need to move and move fast, and this will require some trade-related elements, but they would like more consideration of some of the principles that should underpin this. And in our own work, which I can share afterwards, we've commissioned a report from some leading climate and trade lawyers around the world to help them, to help us all think through what are some of the principles that are already there in international law that should guide our consideration of trade-related policies and measures. And we're hoping that these will be things that will be reflected upon in national parliaments and by stakeholders and businesses as they advocate for trade-related action, to think hard about what the implications of that are for the trading partners and the trading system. And so the 6 principles that we have, which we can speak about later, but the principles they identified were sovereignty, the principle of prevention, principle of cooperation, prohibition of arbitrary and unjustifiable discrimination, and then principles of equity, sustainable development, and common but differentiated responsibilities. And finally, the principles transparency and consultation. Now, putting these 6 principles into practice is not an easy thing, but we felt that if encourage countries and stakeholders to discuss these more, build shared understandings around these, we might have a stronger foundation and stronger trust that will be required to build cooperation around trade, climate and development. Thank you so much, Richard.
Great. Thanks, Carolyn. That's a very comprehensive start to the discussion, and I'm sure we'll come back to a number of these 5 points that you've already raised, because they will resonate, I think, across the discussion. I'm going to turn to Jose Manuel Salazar Zirinax, who is an old friend of UNCTAD and has worked in the international space for quite some years now, previously as the Director in charge of employment at the ILO and currently as the Executive Secretary for the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and an old trade economist, I guess.
And trade minister.
And trade minister, of course. So someone who is well versed in the particular challenges facing the Latin American region, and from Costa Rica, the particular challenges facing small economies, which have their own unique set of challenges when it comes to this. So, Jose Manuel, your opening remarks.
Yes, thank you, Richard, very, very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot for the invitation, and it's an enormous pleasure to share this panel with distinguished, Caroline and Dora Correa and Carlos Lopez, who we've known for many years as well. Look, I think that perhaps to dive directly into the subject, I think first to say that there's no doubt that international trade can contribute to accelerate the climate agenda in several different ways, and also contribute to economic development. But there are many links, multidimensional links, in this complex area. I would like to focus on three of these ways in which trade can contribute. One is minimizing tariff and non-tariff barriers to the trade dissemination of environmental goods and services. In other words, the old subject, if you stand in the WTO and as a trade person, then is, the paradigm of trade liberalization. We know that, of course, there's a big debate now about that, hyper-globalization and too much and so on, but that is still a very important starting point, particularly the liberalization of sustainable goods and services. So in this area, this is not a new conversation. I think for many years there have been different commissions, and certainly in academia and so on, talking about this. And I want to refer to some of the difficulties, I think, in that conversation. One group of difficulties lie on defining what are environmental goods, services, and technologies, or on what constitutes environmentally friendly products, beyond, of course, the traditional obvious categories such as solar panels and windmills, for instance. For instance, are organic fruits and vegetables always more environmentally friendly than non-organic ones? So you have to really get into the production process and all of that, and then, how do you certify, and how do you have, credibility on the information that you might gather? Products from regenerative agriculture, which is now very much coming up in Latin America, are they or not environmentally friendly, and to what extent, and so on. So these are some of the difficult issues you have to sort out. There is already significant progress in different forums on some of these definitions on what are environmental goods and services, eco-labeling issues, and also the whole issue of green washing. But there is a lot of work to do in this area. Another area of challenge is the need to develop standards for circular goods across a product's life cycle. We've done research in ECLAC, and it highlights how the circular economy is a potential driver for green growth, but circular and potentially circular products account for less than 3% of the volume of global merchandise trade currently. And that without going into the details about whether we're using the right definition and categorization of what is, a circular product. By improving the traceability of materials and goods, establishing registers for circular suppliers, creating an internationally agreed definition or a list of goods associated with the circular economy, and removing also importation bans of used goods and waste in general, all of this can contribute a lot to multiple savings in raw materials, in energy and water for industries in Latin America and the Caribbean and any developing countries, such as crop and livestock farming, fishing, aquaculture, and forestry. So this is a completely new area, but we know the world is advancing fast in, towards circular economies and, in cities, in industry, everywhere. So that's a big set of challenges. Yet another area of challenge regarding trade and environmental goods and services is how to consider the ecological footprint of the products. The environmental burden of traded goods has typically been assigned to the production stage. But what happens when the production of emission-intensive goods relocates to developing countries? And there's a whole discussion of carbon leaks and pollution heavens, this kind of negative type of relocation. Now there's all this literature and conversation and reality of reconfiguration of global value chains, semiconductors, this and that. But for years there has been also this kind of perverse relocation, if you like, as developed countries have more stringent regulations and developing countries less. And then that's a challenge for the trade agreement. How do you level that playing field? So trade regimes have to pay attention to emissions embodied in consuming imported goods and deal with the relocation of these high emissions industries to developing countries. This relocation strategy has led to declines in emissions. So, good check for developed countries because they import consumption goods, whereas the emissions of developing countries producing these goods have continued to increase in some cases. This raises important questions about the responsibility. Who is the emitter? Is it the mining industry or the country consuming the products made from these minerals and so on? So that's another area of discussion and of, for clarification and negotiation. Another area of challenge is illustrated by the European Union's recent introduction of the consumption-based approach for regulating deforestation-free products. Well, there is unanimous agreement about ending deforestation. I don't think anybody, well, actually, there are some, but argues against ending deforestation. The practical implementation of this rule may inadvertently encourage further deforestation. Small producers, for example, in the coffee and cocoa sectors are badly prepared to meet the stringent European standards and the certification of compliance, including issues of traceability, georeferencing, due diligence, etc. This is complex, and this poses key questions about what is fair and what is a just transition, and the role of the international aid also to comply with this. That's a difficult discussion, including in the to finalize the EU-Mercosur agreement as one of the issues. Another area of challenge is that of harmonizing technical regulations and standards across countries in environmental goods and services. And this is also crucial to avoid these measures becoming trade barriers. And this is especially true for emerging economic activities like EV batteries and recycling of these batteries, green hydrogen production, and many other issues. And last but not least, a critical consideration lies in how the WTO rules would address, or trade agreements in general, subsidies, soft credits, and other public measures essential for promoting the transformation to climate-neutral economies. And in general for industrial policies, because we have a comeback of industrial policies, which some of us think is good, because we have been arguing all our lives about productive development policies, and we are arguing that Latin America, Latin America has a rate of growth, average rate of growth per year of only 0.8% in the last 10 years. The 10 years that finished this month of December, a decade, and so we're saying this is another lost decade. The rate of growth of Latin America in the lost decade, famous lost decade of the 80s, was 2%. And in this last decade, 0.8%. So it's very important for countries to have not the type of industrial policy of the, for instance, Inflation Reduction Act, because for a number of reasons, but even if we wanted, which I don't think is the case, there is no money with the fiscal restrictions and so on. But then that is actually posing a challenge for trade discussions in terms of the rules and how can you avoid a subsidy war, which countries really have the muscle to do that. So that's a challenge. So that's kind of a few challenges around the issue of purely trade rules, trade liberalization, treatment of different types of goods and services. The other way in which trade can contribute, the second of the three that I'm going to mention, is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, such as the one introduced by the European Commission, initially for iron, steel, cement, fertilizers, aluminium, and electricity generation. While border carbon taxes can make an important contribution, by targeting the high-risk carbon leakage products like these ones, one difficulty for the global trading system is the unilateral introduction by individual countries or group of countries instead of being a multilateral kind of negotiation. Because if you go the way of unilateral application by one country or by a group of countries, this can potentially affect trade and exclude developing countries. In other words, you have some sort of protectionism. Now, the good news, and the Europeans, must be said, have been careful about this, is that under the system being introduced by the European Union, if you are a country exporting to the EU and you have a carbon tax, nationally, a national carbon tax, and if a company pays the national tax, it doesn't have to pay the European import border carbon tax. So this is good because this is a system that creates an incentive in countries exporting to the EU to gradually introduce carbon taxation, contributing to increase the fiscal space to replace other distorting taxation. But this is, again, this is only beginning to happen, right? The application of the circular economy strategies that I mentioned by various countries in the region, and this is mentioned in the nationally determined contributions, also present challenges and opportunities. On the positive side, the application of these strategies encourages the production of export of goods and services with higher value-added content, promoting diversified local production and consumption, etc. However, this also necessitates substantial investments in new production methods and the modernization of regulatory schemes. And to finish, the third element and third way to align climate, trade, and the development agenda is related to the ambitious productive development policy agenda that I said that we actually are recommending that developing countries should have. And in this regard, the WTO trade agreement should increase also, apart from the issue that I mentioned about to what extent and how to deal with the new kind of wave of subsidies and so on, to increase the aid for trade in support of trade-related capacity building in developing countries to improve supply-side constraints present in the countries of the region, as you mentioned, Caroline, technology and so on. The issue of aid for trade continues to be very important, and here these are issues that we at UNCTAD, the ITC, ECLAC, development banks, and the WTO should support efforts for policy coherence and to align the trade agenda with the climate and development agenda. Well, I have a few other details and so on, but since we are going to have questions, I think I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to a lot of your points, Jose Manuel. I will certainly come back to some of your points. But I think it's true that the big emitters have big responsibilities, and we have one big emitter here in the room with the European Union, and they, as Jose Manuel has pointed out, have begun to integrate trade into the climate agenda already, with pros and cons. But that's a very important step forward in terms of thinking about the relationship between trade and climate. So we have Dora Correa, who is the director of the European Commission, DG Trade, and with a responsibility, I think, for Africa and the Pacific region in particular, Asia, I think, too, in terms of trade negotiations. So, Dora, you have the floor for your understanding of the challenge from the European perspective.
Thank you very much, and good morning to you all. Indeed, part of my title is this geographical scope that you mentioned, Richard, but I also have trade and sustainability. So that shows that indeed the European Union is taking very seriously the need to bring up the nexus between trade and climate. And I would start by actually acknowledging that the diagnosis that you have set out at the beginning, that the triangle between trade, climate and development is fraught with tensions currently, is one I could very much concur with. And actually, I think the fact that we are having this conversation today is already an important sign of progress relative to where we were, for example, 3 or 5 years ago, where there was very much a very silo approach to these issues. So the nexus between climate, trade and development is indeed at the heart as well of the discussion here in the trade day at the COP, the first ever trade day. Again, a very powerful message. And I would also like to concur with what Caroline said about the criticality of trade in the development and climate discussion currently. So on these premises, I would like to focus 2 main issues in my presentation. First of all, I would like to tell you a little bit how this, let's say, positive drive towards trade and development have been cutting across the design and implementation of the big environmental and climate measures the EU has been putting on the table. And we've mentioned already CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and deforestation. And then also give some concrete examples of engagement bilaterally and multilaterally. So in terms of our climate and environment measures, as you said, Richard, of course, the EU is one of the major global emitters, and as such, we had to take our responsibilities. So the EU is actually walking the talk in terms of the commitments that we have taken in previous COPs, and we have done a very thorough legislative agenda to allow us to meet our carbon targets for 2030 and 2050. Now, when designing these measures, we have strived to ensure the biggest transparency and active engagement possible, and to take into account the genuine concerns of our trading partners. We have done that through the design phase, and we are now doing that for the start of implementation. Let me pick up on the CBAM example, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which, of course, I need to contest the fact that it is a protectionist measure. It is not, because it basically mirrors the emission trading system we have in the EU. So it applies in a very even-handed and non-discriminatory manner, and of course incentivizes decarbonization, as you were saying earlier on, by recognizing existing schemes. Now, when we designed this measure, we had a constant and very open dialogue with our partners in WTO and also bilaterally. The actual design of the methodologies to measure embedded carbon in the products was done in an inclusive manner with different expert groups, including representatives from trading partners, and it has led to a very long transition period for CBAM phase-in of 9 years. So this is really to allow for implementation to be done in a very gradual and soft manner. This is also, of course, to test the different methodologies and also to actually learn from what is going on in other countries and support businesses, and in particular SMEs, in the actual implementation of this mechanism. And let me give you a concrete example. We saw, for example, that one particular LDC, Mozambique, had a big issue in terms of the implementation of CBAM because of their aluminium exports to the EU and the fact that these exports represented a big share in their economy, in their exports. So we actually engage a very strong dialogue with Mozambique to help transform its energy sector, and we invested over 220 million euros to bring that sector to more renewable energy generation capacities. And this, we hope, will help reduce emissions in the aluminium production and hence minimize the impact of CBAM. Of course, this is part of the general aid for trade that the EU provides, is one of the biggest providers in the world. And also it's part of the general climate envelope that we have under our external development assistance, which amounts to over 27 billion euros for 7 years. So again, a very important support there. The second example I would like to give, and José Salazar also mentioned it, is deforestation, where indeed we see that the fact that the EU is such a big market was actually contributing to deforestation in the major countries producing the commodities imported by the EU. So the deforestation regulation is basically an environment measure which bans from the EU market those products which were produced with and leading to deforestation. It is, again, a very ambitious target, but in my discussions with our trading partners, in particular developing countries, the objective is not being put into question. And this is also something previous speakers have said, and it's very important to highlight. It's not the objective which is put into question. The questions that we have is how do we comply with it? What do we need to do? Help us doing that. And to give you an example, for cocoa, we have engaged in a very deep and intense dialogue with the major producing countries. This is Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Cameroon, in what we call the Sustainable Cocoa Initiative, where we work with the national cocoa boards and the small producers on the ground, with civil society and with EU importers and businesses to bring about a more sustainable production. And we are very happy to see that this has already had a very concrete result, which is for the application of an ISO standard, a regional ISO standard for traceability and certification. And this will be extremely important when the deforestation regulation kicks in a little bit over a year's time, to allow for these countries to export sustainable cocoa to the EU. So that is the second example of how we engage in terms of putting our climate and environment measures into force, whilst taking into account our partners' concerns. Of course, in terms of engagement, the EU, as you know, is a very strong proponent of trade relations, and it has a number of trade agreements across the world. We also have in our trade toolbox instruments which particularly target developing countries, and the generalized system of preferences is one of them. It's a very generous unilateral offer by the EU to developing countries by opening up our market free of tariffs. And the most generous offer in that package, what we call the GSP Plus, comes with strings attached in terms of sustainability. So for countries to be able to become a GSP Plus beneficiary, they have to show that they are not only, of course, they have not only ratified, but they are also implementing effectively the Montreal Protocol, for example, on the ozone layer depleting substances, or the CBD, the Biological Diversity Convention, just to name a few. There's a whole list of over 20 environmental and human rights conventions. So that's a very strong trade tool at the service of greater sustainability. I'm not going to go into all the bilateral agreements we have across the developing world, but also to say that we are very much engaged multilaterally and in the WTO to explain and to consult on our environment and climate measures. Of course, through the Committee on Trade and Environment, the different plurilateral initiatives in WTO. But I just want to focus on the Coalition of Trade Ministers for Climate, which we launched just January this year. And there's a little flyer available just there if you want to know more about the coalition, because I see Richard is already telling me that I'm over time. And I'm happy to talk about that later in the Q&A. Just to say and to highlight that this coalition of trade ministers for climate is a very open and inclusive group, and it actually has a very strong membership from developing countries as well. So I stop here and I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dora. I'm going to turn quickly now, last but not least, to Carlos Lopez, who had a long career in the UN system, culminating as Executive Director of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and he's currently a professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Governance in Cape Town, and someone we turn to when thinking about the challenges around industrialization, climate, and development issues for the African continent. And we need to say that industrialization remains a priority for the African continent. It is an energy poor continent, so the scaling up of energy is absolutely critical for the continent as it diversifies and industrializes it. So it's a big set of challenges in many respects. You are on the front line of this trade, climate, development challenge, Carlos. So your views on what you think needs to be done.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be with friends like you and Juan Manuel, and having the great company of the other panelists. Let me make a bit of a provocation to start. I'm talking from the angle or from the region that has attained net zero, okay? Because if we see the emissions of Africa and the capacity of sequestration of the continent, we are in the positive, so we are net zero. So we have the moral authority to tell others what to do, not others to tell us what to do, because we are the only ones that have attained net zero. And if we take that into account, and I said it's a provocation, and we look into trade as basically, trade policy as basically a trade-offs, we have to make choices. We cannot make choices in such a way that to mitigate, we are going to increase asymmetries and inequality. Yes, we have to mitigate, but we have to mitigate in such a way that we don't increase asymmetries and inequalities. And if we do that, then we have to respect the Africans as players in this space that should be not just accommodated, but should be respected in terms of common but differentiated responsibilities. Therefore, what we are witnessing is a battle of jurisdictions, where one jurisdiction that has muscles is capable of imposing a rule, a standard, a taxonomy, a certification to others, to third parties. And obviously they clash sometimes with another powerful player. But the Africans are there in the middle, like the elephants with the little hands, you know, trying to see which is which. And, you know, you tussle them because you want to, you know, condemn their connections with China for X number of activities. And the Chinese will retaliate, as they are doing right now, by decreasing quite substantially their investment in the continent because of all kinds of initiatives that have been taken of late. So this is not very good news for Africa, that we are entering into a geopolitical difficult moment. And this geopolitical difficult moment is taking trade into a very different direction from what we have seen until recently. We have seen trade as the driver of globalization. Now we are seeing trade being used to deglobalize to a certain extent by making sure that you introduce a new concept of productivity. It's no longer producing where is the cheapest. It's producing where you have a certain degree of safety and you produce in ways that are friendly to the environment. So no reasons to be against that, but it is being done with a battle of jurisdictions, with unilateral decisions. And definitely CBAM is a unilateral decision. And it's not really for Africans to be compensated with aid to help them conform with what has been at the beginning a unilateral decision. Because that has been more or less our story. We have been in 6 decades of development without developing properly. Why? Because we have always been told that the theory of comparative advantages was for us to be commodity exporters. And we are exporting those commodities, and now we are being told how these commodities should conform with new rules. That's not what we want. What we want is to industrialize, not to conform with new rules for commodities. And if we are going to industrialize, we want to industrialize with space that is not available to us, but should be available to us because of this moral ground I just mentioned. And that is called climate finance. It's not a coincidence that we talk about de-risking. Why do we need to de-risk what is good for nature? It's because the business as usual is not good for nature. That's why we need to de-risk. And if we are going to de-risk, and we are going to create the mechanisms that are going to compensate these investments for the good things for the planet, in terms of concessional lending, in terms of investment, in terms of different pledges that we hear in every COP, then we have a problem, because we are not touching the regulatory system. It is the regulatory system that is going to make a difference. For instance, the way we deal with BEPS is extremely important, because Africans have, of the last 6 decades, been under real difficulties with their extractive industries in particular, but other commodities as well, because of BEPS, and because also of being boxed into this category of comparative advantages. So trade is essential for us to do not just the transition for a carbon footprint that is much more in conformity what we want the world to be, but taking into account the fact that we are already net zero, we should have the space to be able to implement a certain number of policies that are much more in conformity with our own development needs, which are, as you know, the greatest in the world. So I think if we look into the perspective of how productivity is now being measured, and with the notions like friendly shoring, with notions like circular economy, and all this battery of new taxonomies that are being introduced, we are basically saying that we are going to repatriate as much as we can industrial capacity. Well, that's what IRA and other green deals, etc., are about. But honestly, if we look into the demographics of the world, this is going to work halfway. In other words, yes, these countries have the fiscal space to do it, but it's not just fiscal space. They have a regulatory system that allows them to print money. Let's call it by its name. That we don't, because we have to follow rules to be able to be boxed and be part of the system. And this is where we have to touch the real change, because we need a system where some of the regulatory dimensions, like for instance what the Bank of International Settlements say about sustainability, matters. And so far, they are more concerned about stress testing the banking system to be able to respond to the crises that have been created with exogenous shocks, I admit, but also by the greed in some countries in the north, than actually to respond to sustainability concerns. And as a result, the international banking system is deserting Africa, our liquidity is being squeezed, we don't have opportunities to actually even go into a commercial lending that is already quite prohibitive. We pay an Africa premium risk that can be 5% or more. And this is not going to be compensated by some aid here, some aid there. We have to really change the equation. And that's what the Africans are asking. They are asking for rules that are going to create the opportunities for them to implement industrial policy that is going to create the jobs for a population profile that is very different from other regions in the world. And that is in the benefit of everybody. And particularly important, it will be the best return on investment if we take into account sustainability dimensions. If we don't take them into account, or you pretend that it's better to invest on sustainability, carbon neutrality, and all the rest in countries where the return is much lower, then, we pay the price in the planet. If we really want to introduce lots of taxes related to carbon, I'm absolutely for. Introduce them to the consumers. Thank you.
Carlos, thank you very much. Of course, we're running late, unfortunately, and I know there's a strict deadline from the organizers. So I'm just going to pick up, and if you can just, in 2 minutes, pick up on each of a point that you made, and just to elaborate a little bit, with the emphasis on a little. Because Carolyn, I mean, the technology story is, like the trade story, is incredibly neglected in the climate space, other than talk about carbon capture and storage, which is surrounded by all kinds of problems and issues. But the issue of technology transfer, as Carlos clearly recognized, I think, in what he said, is going to be central here. And you raised it, you raised the obstacles. How do we accelerate that debate? What are the mechanisms that we need to see in place actually to put green technology transfer onto the agenda in a serious way?
Thank you very much, Richard. It's one of the toughest questions in the trading system has been technology transfer for a long time. One of the key things by process I think we need to do is to connect the discussions on tech transfer with environment discussions and trade discussions, because they often happen in silos. In the WTO, there's sort of siloed discussion. We're actually just about to publish a paper by a great expert from the Philippines who's gone through all of the technology needs assessments that have been done in the context of the UNFCCC, both for mitigation and adaptation. And there you find that this extraordinary work has already been done by developing countries, identifying what their needs are. So the first thing is we don't need to start from scratch. It's there, this is well documented. The thing we need to look at is what are the mechanisms, and the mechanisms to date haven't been working. So I think 3 things will be useful. One is I think we need to look, we need to understand better the evidence of what really is stopping technologies, not only being sort of transferred, but being used and taken advantage of and adapted and then produced domestically in developing countries. Because the real thing is also how to make them players, not just to receive their imported technology, but to use it to generate regional value chains and regional markets and so on in their own countries. So I think we need to do more and more to understand what are the mechanisms that are failing. I think we need to take a lot harder look at how we're using intellectual property policies and what the scope, and here I say that very carefully, we need to understand how they're working or not. We need to be open to the fact that it might be that the rules are fine in certain countries. We need to have different licensing arrangements, different standards, different investment and financing to back transfer of technologies. In other instances, it might be that we really need to think the application of certain IP rules to certain kinds of technologies if we need them to move rapidly and fast. It's just like it is with vaccines. We need to have a really thorough discussion about the role of the IP system and how it can be balanced in that regard. And the third thing, I think we need to look at environmental goods and services. I mean, there are some, but I think here, instead of launching or not launching new rounds of liberalization on EGS, we need to focus governments on what are the problems you're trying to solve. It's about energy access, or it's about clean energy access, or it's about getting the right technologies for certain adaptation challenges. Let's look at those problems, work out what the matrix of trade and trade-related constraints are, and discuss them as a package. It might be tariffs, it might be non-tariff barriers, it might be problems with standards or access to financing, or companies having the resources to acquire these technologies. So we have to look at it in a way that we're actually trying to solve a problem, not just waving a trade tool wand that we have, but to solve the problem at hand. Hope that's helpful.
Okay, great. Thank you. Maybe developing a little bit with Jose Manuel. I mean, as a long-standing advocate of industrial policy, and we worked on that issue together, we have a very ambivalent attitude towards the IRA. That is, there's lots of things in the IRA that we really welcome, that have been missing from the dialogue, including in developing countries for a long time. But at the same time, we worry about the way in which it's being pursued. And you mentioned that in your remarks, Jose Manuel. What are the steps forward? How do we move what is a positive development from a policy point of view in terms of bringing industrial policy? It never went away, but it was always in the cupboard somehow, right? And it was always there or used under another name. Now it's in the open. How do we actually get it to work in a way that doesn't reproduce the asymmetries that Carlos talked about?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Well, I think the first, put it in the big context of things. It's great news that you have this kind of strong industrial policy now, because then that is time for developing countries to stop arguing whether they should have productive development policies or not. And you and I and many colleagues and many present here have always, our lifetimes, we have a joint book on, transforming economies and the role of industrial policy for job creation and economic transformation and so on. And a lot of the debate, and I think it's being a very paralyzing debate in Latin America, has been, no, that is not the role of the state, let the private sector do it, this is picking winners. I mean, now anybody that comes with that argument, unfortunately there are still people, economists particularly, with that argument, is really living in, I don't know which century, but certainly not this one. So I think the good news is that the question here is not whether to do industrial policy, but how, which is very much what we've been discussing here also on all these difficult issues of trade and climate and the link with development. And what we are promoting from ECLAC, let's say, in terms of the message to Latin American and Caribbean countries, based on this syndrome of low growth that I mentioned, is, look, there is lots of ways of doing smart industrial productive development policies that do not go through subsidies. I mean, we have to say industrial policy is not really equivalent to subsidies. The first thing is it's a question of organization. We come from this debate saying some people believe in the magic of the market, others believe in the magic of the state. Well, this is time to start believing in the magic of the processes of collaboration between the public and private sector, public-private partnerships, and collaboration with different sectors. You have to do also territorial, bottom-up, not just top-down kind of policies and efforts. We are promoting a lot the idea of industrial clusters. Europe has a tremendous experience on that. There is an European cluster observatory with around 3,000 successful, very interesting cases. The Catalonia, the Basque Country. So all that is industrial policy. All that is, now that is cheap to do. To do the actual cluster and the collaboration is to organize the processes of multiple iteration between the key players. The key players are going to move the needles of productivity, of innovation, of this and that. The question comes that when you organize a collaborative game like that in a cluster, in a sector, very quickly they develop a list of investments and empty places in the value chain and so on, and then they need a road, they need a refrigeration here, they need of course all the issue of human talent. This is crucial. I think a lot of the issue of industrial policy and the great weakness in Latin American developing countries, you don't have the talent to do many of these things. That's the main restriction. And by the way, that's also the restriction for technology and technology transfer. I mean, you first have to have the people to, and it goes hand in hand. That's what I like a lot about the cluster approach, because, it is solving concrete problems, just in time and based on the restrictions that you have. Now, so in that sense, I will put it in perspective, a lot of the industrial policy debate starts at home and in the countries and on the ground. Now, there are some manifestations in the trading system, but I wouldn't start in the trading system, And I agree, I sympathize a lot with this idea that we have to focus on the problems, not, how do you say, not wave the wand of just the trade liberalization. Let's see, Latin America, let's put an example. Now, several Latin American countries with all these strategic minerals, there's a huge possibility, and there's, lithium and zinc, and all the minerals that the electromobility revolution in the world needs, not just the decarbonization of Latin America. Latin America has, 50-60% of the global reserves of many of these things. But then the big question is not just how to do more extractive industries as usual, but how to add value. And that is industrial policy. And I think there's a big conversation that, and the same, one can put examples in other areas that has to be had, a little bit like the global gateway of the EU, industry by industry, what kind of collaboration, and that's where you can get the trade dimension and the aid for trade and the, partnership and finance.
Okay. I'm going to ask Carlos before I come back to you, Dora, just to follow up on that, because you've argued for, in the context of the continental free trade area, that industrialization, industrial policy is critical. Do African countries, though, have the space to undertake the kind of industrial policies, or that Jose Manuel talked about as well, or are there genuine obstacles in the rules of the multilateral system that are going to make it difficult for the continental free trade of Africa to work, because to work it has to combine climate, industrialization, and trade and development? And do you have the space to do that, or do we need fundamental changes to the rules?
No, I think there is space, but not enough. There is obviously a possibility for the continental free trade area to boost the opportunities for intra-Africa trade. And intra-Africa trade has been sort of underestimated, and it is a colossal opportunity in certain types of value chains. For instance, agro-processing, because of the demographics, is one that comes to mind. The fact that we have difficulties with energy access, of course, is a major impediment for major industrialization drive. So unless we resolve the problem of energy access, this is going to be extremely difficult. But Africa also has some advantages in the current negotiations. Critical minerals have been mentioned. Africa has many of them. So this can create opportunities for imposing rules of engagement from the investors that obliges for them to invest in transformation. And some countries are already going in that direction. And I think we are going to promote more and more those policies. It's also very important to take into account the fact that although labor as a unit value in industrial productivity has been diminishing, it's still important for certain types of value chains. Because even with automation, robotization, you cannot replace completely the value of labor in a huge number of value chains. And Africa is going to have an advantage because it's going to have a very young population. And finally, on IT, that normally is associated with high concentration of intellectual property value, is also only possible if you expand its utilization in terms of consumers. And the more tech-intensive products and processes are going to be, the more appealing they will be to younger population, the more difficult they will be to aging population.
Okay, great. Dora, you have the last word. I don't want to go into the weeds of CBAM, but I think one of the points that you made is that there are adjustment costs involved, and that will require financial transactions of some kind, aid for trade, say it how you like, if it's not going to reproduce damage in those countries that are part of that CBAM process, the exporters. What's the European Union going to do in terms of providing compensation for countries that do face significant adjustment costs when it comes to implementation of CBAM?
Thanks, Richard. I would not use the word compensation. I think it's more a question of working together to define how we're going to put this in place, what methodologies we're using, how the reporting will be taking place, and then also work together either in a plurilateral or multilateral setting to actually have a global definition of how to define the carbon embedded emissions. And this is important for all. I mean, the whole purpose of the COP is to decarbonize. So this should be a joint endeavor of all the signatories of this treaty and of all UN members, in fact. So the question is rather, how do we all together go on this path, and how do we do it for mutual benefit in terms of achieving the targets we have set ourselves? I also wanted to say a word about this issue of that we were talking about, industrial policy and investment, if you allow me, because and I'm not going to comment on IRA, of course, but from our point of view, what is indeed fundamental is not as much reshoring, but it's actually increasing the resilience of our value chains. And to do that, diversification is the key word. Diversification of our supply chains, diversification of our sourcing. And I think this presents huge opportunities for Africa and for many other developing countries. So, and what we are doing in this respect is working very much with our partners, not only in terms of trade and facilitating trade, but also in terms of investment. And we are now adding a sustainable investment facilitation agreement to our trade tools, which is part of our proposal to African countries. We've concluded the first one just a few weeks ago, and we are in exploratory conversations with 3 more countries. The idea is to create a conducive business environment that attracts investors to developing countries to exactly facilitate the industrialization and facilitate the adding value in source countries rather than working with previous models of trade relations. So I just want to say that bit of investment. And on the sustainability angle, just to highlight, we are going to sign in a few weeks a trade agreement with Kenya, which is an extremely ambitious agreement in terms of sustainability. It's second only to New Zealand. So that shows how the narrative on sustainability is evolving and changing in Africa, and how much this nexus between trade and sustainability can yield results.
Okay, thank you very much, Dora. I have to wrap up. I know we've run over time, so I'm not going to even try to summarize. But I mean, there's a lot of issues raised that I think we all need to pick up on and think about hard, because they will have a profound influence on finding the right path forward. So let me just thank Carolyn, Dora, Jose Manuel, who had to leave, and Carlos for their great presentations, and we look forward to further debate around these issues. So, and thank you all for listening to the presentations too. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's having a great afternoon. Now, as you can see, it's hot in here. And that's partly climate change. So we're here to try and fix climate change, but through the lens of trade. We must harness really the power of trade to try and support the clean energy transition, but also scale up some of these climate-friendly goods and services, decarbonize supply chains and emission-intensive sectors, and also shift markets towards a sustainable trajectory. So we're together for 1 hour. Presidents and prime ministers will come in and out of the session, so we'll make it lively and keep it entertaining. But to kick us off, I would love to call on stage Dr. Ngozi, Secretary General of the WTO.
Well, thank you, Francine. And you can see I'm already having fun. It's lovely to do this with so many wonderful friends around. Ajay, Mark, Faike. We also have Minister Anders. We're expecting Minister Colonna and Prime Minister Motley shortly. And we're also expecting the Chinese climate envoy, Mr. Xi Shenhua. So we have a good crowd, and I can see a lot more familiar faces in the room. So thank you all for coming here today. And Francine, thank you for taking this on. So welcome to the COP28 Trade House. This pavilion, jointly hosted by the WTO, ITC, UNCTAD, and the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, embodies the increasingly widespread recognition that trade is part of the solution to the climate crisis. You know, when I joined the WTO, being a true believer in action to combat climate change, I said one of the first things we must do is bring trade back into the conversation, not as part of the problem, as people constantly see it. And I'm not trying to say that trade is not part of the problem, the logistics of trade, shipping, aviation. That's what people think about, but they typically do not think that trade is a huge part of the solution and that without it, we cannot really get to net zero by 2050. So today we have a group of influential leaders who also happen to be some of the most innovative thinkers around on how to update and improve the international economic order writ large, but also how to go about climate change and finding innovative solutions that are effective and equitable for people and the planet. In Glasgow 2 years ago, trade and trade policies were, as I said, almost completely absent from the high-level discussions on how to meet the Paris Agreement goals. But now, we know that trade is an indispensable mechanism for diffusing low-carbon technology around the world. Global supply chains were already an important factor and one of the few reasons for climate optimism, namely the plummeting cost of solar and wind energy. A growing body of research and analysis has highlighted the importance of trade to climate mitigation and adaptation. We at the WTO Secretariat have been doing our part to contribute to this work. Underscoring how the climate policy debate has shifted, 2 days from now, we will have the first ever trade day at a climate COP. Did I say 2 days? Yes, 2 days from now. Trade is featuring prominently in discussions throughout the COP, with a wide range of sessions looking at different aspects of the nexus between trade and climate. And the fact that we have all the good friends we've said now just shows you how wide-ranging the concern is. I forgot to highlight Jean Leon, who is the president of the Caribbean Development Bank, who is also here with us. This event is therefore a housewarming party. So we in the WTO Secretariat, we've prepared a welcome gift for you, a set of 10 trade policy tools for climate action, and you can find the copies in the back. We've not only prepared it, we've made it look nice. I just wanted to say that it's a very good fan. You know, my lovely, wonderful institution, the World Bank, is not the only one capable of making nice reports. The research is based, the publication is based on the Secretariat's research and on practical steps that many countries can take and are already taking. Some WTO members are already doing some of what we said to use trade policy to accelerate and amplify climate action. The tools in the publication focus on issues at the heart of delivering a people-centered green transition, bringing down the cost of clean energy, decarbonizing supply chains, repurposing subsidies, and creating new business opportunities in the emerging low-carbon economy. The idea is to give countries policy options to consider implementing at home or even making part of their nationally determined contributions. As my colleague Rebecca Greenspan said yesterday when we had another session, if you look at NDCs, you'll find very little reference to trade. And yet countries are taking some actions that are very much linked to trade, and this set of actions will help. Now, to take a couple of examples, one of the tools deals with import tariffs. For historic reasons unrelated to climate change, tariffs are typically tilted in favor of higher carbon goods and against green alternatives. Key fossil fuels such as crude oil and coal, for instance, face average tariffs of 0.8 and 1.6% respectively, whilst renewable energy equipment faces average tariffs of 3.2% and applied tariffs as high as 12%. So we are actually doing the opposite of what we want to do in many of our countries. We are not incentivizing use of renewable energy. And I know that when I was finance minister in my own country, we had to look at this because we had lower tariffs on second-hand cars coming into the country, which are very, use diesel and fossil fuels and others. So reviewing and rebalancing tariffs would help increase the uptake of low-carbon solutions. Another tool is public procurement. Governments spend around $13 trillion every year on purchases of goods and services, 13% of global GDP, which is directly and indirectly responsible for an estimated 13 to 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. Introducing climate-sensitive criteria into public tenders would boost demand for emission savings goods and services. Meanwhile, keeping public markets open, transparent, and competitive in line with the WTO government procurement agreement would help ensure value for money. So let me now conclude by urging all of you to take a careful look at the publication. The executive summary is only 5 pages long. There's really no excuse not to skim through it. Between the planetary imperative to get to net zero and the higher borrowing costs facing much needed green investment, it is more important than ever to use every tool in our policy toolbox to meet the climate crisis. Trade is a tool we just cannot afford to neglect. Now, before I close, I want our staff, some of whom are here, who worked on this, to stand up so that they can get deserved recognition. So, Ralph, Violetta, Ho, is Ho here? Yeah. Jean-Marie, Yuvan, congratulations to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Ngozi. So we have Mark Carney and Ajay Banga to get us started, really to lay out some of the groundwork. Ajay, can you lay out how the World Bank is actually supporting some countries to leverage trade to do good for climate change?
First of all, I think a booklet like this, all the jokes aside of the fanning, I think a booklet like this is actually mission critical, because I think the kind of topics that Ngozi is talking about inside this booklet are things that get taken for granted, Francine, in a lot of countries, and the mistakes happen all the time. I was talking to Pablo, and he sent me some material to read on this panel. Interestingly, in a number of countries, the countries charge 35% tariffs on electric accumulators, which is what you need for a solar system. If you put in a 35% tariff on an electric accumulator, you're actually disincentivizing any kind of ability to bring that in. So that kind of thing, which appears like a very small lever to move, is actually a critical lever. So getting policy, and this is the bigger picture to me, I think getting policy, all type, regulatory policy, trade policy, to work in a way that's constructive for renewable energy is really important. I give this example all the time, but if I'm a private investor and I go to a country and I can see a 10-year plan on solar energy, I know it might change if the government changes, but I have a good sense of where their true north is. If I get a sense of where they're going with solar, I want 30% of my energy to be from solar. Just an example. And I think I'm willing to put regulatory policy and tariff policy in line there. That gives me as a private sector a great deal of reassurance to put money there. So it's in the same context that I think small things like tariff policy, small to that country, but big for the sector, are kind of important. I've got one other thing to say on that topic. A little while back, we've launched an effort called RISE. RISE is funded by a number of countries, Japan, Italy, Korea, the US, a few others. And the idea is to diversify the supply chains of the materials that are required for the energy transition into electric batteries. Africa happens to be full of those materials, but Africa, if we don't do something about helping them extract those minerals, but then do value-added manufacturing in their countries, we will end up with those minerals just being sourced as an extractive economy. To me, those kinds of things, funded by the effort that the EU is doing with the Global Gateway, these are all very interesting for getting developing countries to take advantage of their natural resources, but in a value-added way as compared to just a extractive way. So I think it's also an important element of trade policy.
Thank you so much. Mark Carney, how should investors actually look at some of these trade dynamics?
Sure. Thank you. Well, let me say a couple of things. First, and you, Ngozi, and your staff for putting trade at the heart of addressing climate change. And it's an honor to be here, and it's great to be here in Trade House. I'll make a couple of points. One is I'll acknowledge something that I think we all know is going on, but I just let's put it out there, which is the de-risking, that trend in the global economy. Now, this actually, from a climate perspective, I'm going to say something maybe counterintuitive, is positive in the following sense. Experience is that as companies are considering adjusting their supply chains, value chains, whether it's marginal or wholesale, the first question they have, apart from trade routes and trade access, is what's their scope 2 emissions going to be in a country? It should be absolutely clear that in trade diversion, to use the formal term, but in trade decisions, large multinational companies have basically zero interest in buying in new scope 2 emissions. So having a clean expansion of clean grid matters absolutely. The broader issue is troubling, and I'll come back to it. Second point is something as arcane as climate disclosure and scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are hugely important because they're emissions in and of themselves, but they go again to value chains. And what they do is they align incentives across the value chain, and in many cases up the chain into emerging and developing economies, so that their clients, who are often in developed economies, work with them to get emissions down, because they ultimately will have this. And that dynamic is just starting. So when you think about what you can do through trade for disclosure and global reduction, scope 3 matters. Let me make just a couple other quick points, and I'll shut up because I'm going to have to leave. One of the key things is who benefits from, I'll call it industrial policy, subsidies, and others. And so who has access to those trade routes? And that is an open question. I would like to think that building on the seeming success of San Francisco and the APEC, the meetings between the U.S. and China, that we're starting to see a floor and the potential to have climate solutions carved out of this broader de-risking. Last point, there's an announcement later today, announcement in half an hour, of a major initiative that builds off of things that Feike and others began, which is basically buyers, amongst other things, buyer coalitions for the emerging fuels of the future, energies of the future. And what we need to have with that, and I'm not going to front run the COP presidency, but it's major and it has the possibility. And what needs to be at the heart of that, in the spirit of this discussion, is for those emerging technologies, hydrogen, SMRs, carbon capture storage, and on, biofuels, et cetera, that they are fully integrated in a free and open trading system. And we have the capability, because this is just being put in place, in order to establish that.
And Mark, you need to leave to make the announcement, but I'm Bloomberg, so I'll have the breaking news as it breaks, and I will bring it to everyone so we can comment also on here. I'm delighted to also be joined by the Environment Minister of Mauritius. Thank you, sir, for joining us. What do some of these trade policies actually mean for your country and how they relate to climate change?
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few words at this unique event from Mauritius as a sixth country. And Mauritius is pleased that after years of discussions on trade and environment, the issue of trade and climate change is finally being presented. And I would like to be very thankful to COP28 Presidency, the WTO, UNCTAD, ITC, and the ICC for making this possible. So Mauritius welcomes the launch of the menu of trade-related climate policy options by the WTO Secretariat, and we hope that this proves to be a useful tool in helping WTO members transition to a climate-friendly economy. And I would like also, as a sixth country, to say that Mauritius believes that the UNFCCC guiding principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities should be upheld in the WTO trade-related climate policy options. And WTO members should therefore avoid the use of climate change as an excuse for protectionism. And also, I would like to add that despite being a sixth which has contributed negligibly to climate change, Mauritius is taking ambitious steps towards the decarbonization of sectors such as energy, transport, infrastructure, and manufacturing through fiscal incentives and schemes to enhance the penetration of electric vehicles and energy efficiency. Our Energy Efficiency Management Office is working on mandatory minimum energy performance standards for several electrical appliances. We believe that this will increase the import of energy-efficient goods, and now we want to import biomass for our energy transition. We are of the view that it is the duty of all countries to urgently work towards the mitigation of global warming, and Mauritius believes that it is extremely important to facilitate trade in climate-related products, address all barriers, including non-tariff barriers, in trade and goods and services, and that could have a bearing on climate change. So we hope that a declaration is issued at the 13th Ministerial Conference, the MC13, to put on track the Environmental Goods Agreement and to set a framework for the conclusion of this agreement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. Dr. Ngozi, when you look at, I guess, the priorities on the list of leaders, where does trade show up? Does it need to be higher up?
Sure,
let me ask Dr. Ngozi, Minister, and then we'll come to you afterwards.
No, absolutely, Francine, that's the case. It does need to be higher up. As I was mentioning, Rebecca Greenspan, who is the Secretary General of UNCTAD, had her staff look through all the policies, and she found that 600 policies they looked through that countries were implementing through their NDCs. None of them mentioned trade. And yet some of them were related to trade. So I don't think policymakers typically think of trade as being up there. If we look at our own monitoring system, we have, I think it's 18,000 notifications about trade-related actions about climate change related actions that our members have taken, that they notified, but this doesn't come up. So trade is not up there because people don't think of it as a solution. So it absolutely needs to come to the forefront, but it can only do that when we have this kind of gathering where we highlight it. And that is why I'm so excited that so many colleagues have come here and have agreed to take this on. And you know, you saw what Ajay said about the fact of, renewables, just the same kind of example I was given with tariffs that are so high, scope 3 emissions. So there are so many examples of ways in which trade can make a difference if we only reorient the policies.
Mark?
I apologize, Minister, just because I'm going to go in a sec. But I put an issue on the table, which I'm sure you're going to get to, but give a quick perspective, which is around CBAMs and embedded carbon. I'd say from a financing perspective, speaking broadly from a financing perspective, what is increasingly understood is that, at least in heavy emitting sectors, the embedded carbon, whether it's steel, aluminium, cement, in those traded sectors, that there could be some form of trade action against that. And the question, of course, becomes what are the frameworks, how broad they are, what's the glide path, because that is and I'm just doing a neutral observation of this, but that's an element where certain jurisdictions, European Union most particularly, think that, well, in order to have climate action, it has to be twinned with the CBAM, given the carbon leakage, as you know, would otherwise happen. So understanding how the system as a whole is going to evolve for that will be incredibly important, and making sure that, anyways, you get the point.
I actually think Mark's raising a really important point, and there's a connected issue. So look, trade regulations can have unintended consequences, and we should be a little thoughtful about that. So for example, we've got European rules coming out on environmentally non-damaging import of things. So for example, 11 to 12% of what's produced in sub-Saharan Africa in a number of the crops that get exported to Europe could get impacted by that. Ethiopian small farmers with coffee could get impacted by that. Or Mark's earlier point about, scope 2 and scope 3. If William were here, William Ruto, who's not here, so I may as well make his points on his behalf. But he gets 93% of his energy is renewable. Half of that is geothermal. Half of that is hydroelectric. So if I was a guy in a multinational company looking to find a cleaner supply chain, which is really important, William is an obvious destination for my investment. But here's the problem. That works fine at that level. Now, the other way around, if I'm going to look at the supply chain all the way and start looking at the SMEs who supply into that supply chain, it's very hard for them to be able to meet the standards that we're going to start imposing upon them. So we've got good reasons to put these standards in place. What you have to be careful about is you don't damage SMEs, a lot of whom are women and minorities in those countries. So the trade policy issue has both a plus working for it and a very careful minus that we have to manage our way through as we go through this next 5 to 10 years of digesting how to make climate and trade work better together.
Some maybe three small remarks from what I have said preliminary is that in Mauritius we had come forward with the climate change bill in 2020, and we have set forth an interministerial council which is presided by the Prime Minister himself, where we have different ministries concerned, including the Ministry of Trade, which has a responsibility to come forward each year and to say what are the targets which are being set forward in our fight to climate change. Second remark would be that for us the question of finance will always be a pertinent issue. The access to finance, because for us as African country and a CIS country, the main challenge for us is to be qualified and to be eligible for climate finance, which is a major challenge for us. And the third thing to be considered, I think, is that at the level of Mauritius and at the level of various countries, the world today is becoming a global market, and I think we should take into consideration for us to be qualified, because in 2030 we are going to have the Green Deal in Europe, and for our industries to be qualified eventually to export to Europe, it is essential for us to respect the different conditions that are going to be put forward. And I think the link that today exists between the trade sector and the climate sector would be always very much linked, and we should take this in consideration for every policies that we are going to put forward.
Minister, thank you so much. Mark Carney, you have to leave because I promised you you'd be there on time. So thank you so much.
But Mark-
Maybe a round of applause for Mark.
Before he leaves, Francine, as he runs out the door, I just wanted to say, Mark, that there's something you don't know, or maybe you've heard. Yeah,
There's
at
nothing that Mark
Marrakesh,
does not know. There's nothing that
everything.
Mark does not know.
in Marrakesh, we agreed, we talked about this issue of fragmentation of approaches and trade frictions that may come from our different approaches to carbon taxation and pricing. And we agreed to have this task force of the international organizations to try and work out harmonization of, yeah. So we've set it up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
See you, Mark.
Thank you,
See you
Mark.
later.
So also to talk a little bit about trade in a very, very important country, Australia. I think we have Kirsten Tilley, Australia's ambassador for climate change. So Ambassador, would you like to give a couple of remarks on actually the relationship between climate change and trade for your country?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation for the Australian government to be part of this discussion. Look, Australia is an open economy, but a heavily trade-dependent economy, so we certainly pay a lot of attention in this space. Can I begin by thanking you, Director General, and climate leaders on the panel for the discussion so far, but in particular, Director General, for your efforts and tirelessness in bringing the climate and trade international discussions, which are often siloed together, both here at COP but in general, which is an excellent outcome. And thanks as well for the set of trade options, which we'll certainly be taking a good look at going forward. So at home, we've had a new government in for about 18 months, and they've taken a fairly ambitious approach to decarbonising our own economy. But beyond that, as I said, a heavily trade-dependent nation who sends a lot of our goods overseas, both commodities, a lot of energy commodities, currently largely fossil-based. But we do have an ambition in line with rapidly decarbonising our own economy of also becoming a renewable energy superpower. And of course, that's so that we can continue our economic growth, but equally support global, but in particular regional efforts in the Asia Pacific to help that region decarbonise as well. In terms of the important international discussions underway, we're an active participant in the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment. We've joined the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate and the Climate Club. And we strongly support the focus on reform at MC13. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you. I'm delighted, of course, that he was able to join us, Xie Qianhua, the Special Climate Envoy of People's Republic of China. Thank you for joining us. Could you talk to us, sir, a little bit about, of course, the trade policy that China will put in place to mitigate some of the climate change?
中国在采取哪些贸易政策来应对气候变化吗？
各位好，我在这个贸易这个领域，我是外行。我这次来呢，就是向各位来学习。刚才您提的这个问题呢，从事气候变化工作者的这个角度来看，作为政府，它应该支持低碳绿色产品的贸易。要贸易，首先得有产品，所以必须要生产出绿色低碳的产品。比如说，中国现在搞风能、太阳能发电， 可再生能源发电，推动这个电动汽车，还有这个动力电池，在这些领域呢，其实已经做了我们支持绿色的生产，然后这些产品呢，要它进入市场，这个在这一点上，它才能够有贸易。另外，政府呢，除了支持这个绿色的生产之外，对它这个生产链、供应链，要给它一些鼓励性的政策。另外呢，它鼓励它进行贸易，因为只有把低碳的这个产品到世界各国进行贸易，才能够实现用最低的成本、最好的技术、最高的质量来实现我们巴黎协定确定的目标。在这一点上呢，要保证贸易自由。所以说，什么叫绿色的低碳的产品呢？我想应该有一个统一的标准，这个标准符合标准的，它就应该进入市场，而且呢，要对它进行鼓励和保护，而不能设置一些障碍。这样的话呢，就破坏了这个气候友好的产品它进行的贸易。所以我想，第一个要生产出这种绿色的产品，这个产品呢要符合一定的标准，在这种前提之下，要有贸易政策来保护它，不能设置障碍。在这一点上，这是我们基本的一些看法。谢谢。
We have the translation.
Thank you for your question. Actually, I am not an expert in trade, actually, so I'm here to learn from you. And about this question, I think as a government, we must support the trade of green and low carbon products. But to do that, first of all, we must have these products manufactured and produced. For example, now China is a leading manufacturer and producer of renewable power, like wind and solar power, and also electric vehicles, and also power battery. And so we must support the production of green and low carbon products so that these products can go into the market, so that we can have the trade. So, and apart from supporting the manufacturing and production of these products, we must have incentives and encouraging policies for the supply chain and the value chain to encourage trade of green and low carbon products, so that we must have these products to be traded worldwide, and these products must have the lowest cost and the highest quality. Only with this kind of trade can we be more on track to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. So that we must have trade and the products, and then what can be counted as green and low carbon products? I think we must set a standard for that. And for products that meet these standards, we must allow them to go into the market and to be traded freely and not set any barriers. So those are what I want to say to this question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ngozi, are you confident that some of the trade policies put in place will always, at the back of their mind, if not at the forefront, look at climate change?
Well, let me say this. I'm not confident. I wish I could say I was confident. But I feel that as we begin to highlight the importance of trade policy for climate, and this will become more prominent. And as policymakers come to know that, look, we cannot get to net zero. How do we diffuse these technologies? How do we get supply chains that can lower the costs? I think the consciousness of all of this will make policymakers look at trade policy as a more positive force instead of a negative force. And I do want to come back to what Ajay said about critical minerals and supply chains. We cannot get to net zero without some of these critical minerals. So I think, again, that's another touch point where as we try to add value to these critical minerals in the places where they are exploited or extracted, create jobs there, again, people realize we need trade to get those from one place to the other once they are manufactured. So my hope is that trade will become much more will be elevated in the consciousness of policymakers, but it's not going to happen just like that. It will not happen unless we consciously talk about it and highlight it.
And do you think it's coming, Ajay, that it
Yeah,
will be elevated?
I was actually about to make a point on what Ngozi was saying just now. If you look at intra-Asia trade, it's 60% of the trade is intra-Asia. If you look at Europe, it's 70%. Now let's come to Africa. It's 20. So in Africa, it's actually easier and cheaper for all kinds of reasons that she is an expert on to move things out of Africa to faraway destinations to bring them back to Africa. And I think we have to think about how to change that, because that is both ecologically insensible, but it's also a huge lost economic opportunity of trade within the African system to benefit the African continent, as an example, right? And she can tell you a lot about this, but I've been harping on this for a little while. It has to do with logistics. It has to do with trade agreements. It has to do with trade facilitation. It has to do with many of those topics, but they're all important.
Thank you so much. Mr. Xing Shuai, can I ask you about your vision and how your vision actually is evolving for international trade and climate cooperation going forward? So how will it evolve? What's the blueprint that you see now?
这个问题啊，这个发展中国家要参加到整个这个世界的贸易当中来，首先要解决它的能力问题。这个第一呢，要提高它的能力，要有资金的支持，要有技术的支持。比如说中国的风电，成本已经降低了80%，光伏发电的成本降低了90%，这些技术要通过合作。 来，这个才能够在市场上通行。
So for developing countries to participate fully in international trade, first we must help them to enhance their capacity. To do that, we must ensure sufficient financial and technological support. For example, China's cost of wind power has reduced by 80%, and solar power cost reduced by 90%. And so these products like this, we must cooperate to let these cost-efficient products to move freely, to be traded freely on the international market.
Thank you so much. We're delighted also to be joined by Feike Sishdeba, former Chief Executive Officer of DSM, but also Finland's Minister for European Affairs, His Excellency Minister Aldekruts. So thank you. First of all, Minister, could you have a couple of actually, vision for what you see trade and climate for your country and how you see that evolving?
Thank you. Thank you for the really interesting discussion so far. I think you can safely say that the problems we are facing are kind of results of deficiencies in trade. We've had the bad things have been cheap, and the good things have been expensive. But I also believe that trade can be the key, as Ngozi insinuated here. So we need more trade collaboration on all fronts, from bringing down tariffs to streamlining standards and making different national regulations interoperable. Clean energy and climate-friendly technologies, goods and services should be able to flow freely across the globe. And maybe especially when we are facing a massive technological revolution through the green transition, it's especially important that trade is free and transparent, so that we don't, through national subsidies, gain humongous market shares, which then would dominate the whole sector. I mean, suddenly we are in the same situation that we were at the beginning of the 20th century, in the 21st century. So transparency with subsidies and free trade is really essential, so that green transition can be available for everybody. Trade itself, of course, should be climate friendly. For this, optimized logistics and digital solutions are important throughout global supply chains and customs. Here, Finland is doing a lot of work in this area. The Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra, is piloting digital progress passports for the logistics and textiles sections, meaning that of course, you should know what you are buying. The product in itself should be transparent. But we also must get the policy environment right so that global clean energy sectors will innovate, thrive, and expand at the speed and scale that the climate emergency requires. Here, Finland is and has always been in the forefront of pricing carbon. We've had essentially a carbon tax for some 30 years, and here the cap and trade system is really key. I think it has been a success story on a European level. Some 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, we thought that it was too low, that it will never bring the change that we want. And now suddenly it is really causing massive change. And it's doing it in a cost-effective manner. The cap and trade system is the cheapest way of reducing global greenhouse gases. And that's why it's really essential that we expand it outside of Europe and try to make it global, because then we get rid of the essential problem that we have had, that bad things have been cheap and good things have been expensive. So I'm happy that it's in Europe we are expanding it to the transport sector, and of course we hope that the other global players soon would follow suit and adopt it in their policies.
Thank you so much. I'm also told by a reliable source that Prime Minister Motley is on her way. So before we go to her, Feike, give us a sense of how you view this and actually what kind of trade we'll end up with in a couple of years.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, compliments to Dr. Ngozi for the policy tools for climate action from a trade perspective. Let me make 2 remarks. One building on yours. Carbon pricing, in some countries taxation, in some countries tax and cap and trade, but carbon pricing is a great tool to move further on climate action. However, the compliance market is too small in that sense that only 25% of global emissions fall under a carbon pricing system, so we need to increase that. The second thing is voluntary carbon markets. And here I would like to have the help of the WTO, the World Bank, etc. On the voluntary carbon market collapsed last year. And the main reason is there is not any institution independent who certifies the credibility of the credits. And the credibility of the credits went down. There's a pricing difference of a factor 10 in the different voluntary carbon markets, and that is not helpful. And then we throw away a great tool. That's one. The second thing is, and we were discussing the island states and Africa, etc., the most vulnerable countries of the world can not only wait till we are done with our mitigating actions. They want, in addition, not instead, in addition, adaptation. And they want new seeds who can survive also with droughts or floodings or new water systems or protection of cities or infrastructure. And there's a lot of best practices on adaptation. The private sector is only contributing for 0.5% globally, so that's nothing. So we need to get the private sector also involved in adaptation and have the right implementation of the best practices, especially in the most voluntary countries. Those 2 points on adaptation and voluntary carbon credits, I think can help and fit totally with the report of WTO to address further climate action.
Thank you. Thank you so much. President Leon, you're, of course, in charge of the Caribbean Development Bank. So how do you see the challenges, but also the way forward?
Thank you for this. I think my 2 comments I want to make goes beyond just the Caribbean or the Caribbean Development Bank. I want to make the first comment linking trade and climate, and to say that while the DG has been an advocate in making that link, it ought to go beyond just trade and climate, because trade, climate are linked inextricably with poverty reduction and with the attainment of SDG goals, and therefore it is trade, climate, and development that is interlinked. And consequently, what you have is a system, and that system is the way we should be looking at the entirety. So trade for me is not just growth enhancing, but trade is also equity, inequity reducing. And so what I want to be able to make a very important point here is that while as Ngozi was saying, some people are arguing trade was contributing to greenhouse gases. At the same time, I think the issue of regulation that was raised by Mark just before he left becomes super important, because as we impose regulations, what in fact we will end up doing is disadvantaging the very countries that need the trade to reduce their poverty, and therefore we need to be very careful about the relationship between regulating and reducing the trade, for example, in the food security area, where short distance to table is being seen now as a way of mitigating climate change. By doing this, what you end up doing is actually preventing the very countries that need trade to reduce their poverty to actually grow. So I think one big point we really should keep an eye on. And the second is with regard to finance. All of the necessary infrastructure investments that we need to make trade occur has to be financed. And so it has to be accessible and affordable, as I think Ajay was saying. And that is where the MDBs come into the picture. How can we actually provide that financing, but targeted with a purpose to providing the greening to make trade not an impediment, but an inequity reducing element as we actually go forward. So those would be the 2 points and comments I'd want to make.
Can I ask you, and we are expecting Prime Minister Motley any second now, you talk about the structural concern that actually we're not thinking about things right. Why? Is there a misconception? Are we not following through?
Because I think what we are missing is the element of genuine reform that we are talking about. The world has grown on the principle of periphery to center. And we have concentrated power in one or two institutions or one or more communities, which is the locus of attention. And the only way, if you take a systemic approach to this, the only way you get out of it is by at least sharing. Sharing from center back to periphery, whether it be in terms of the opportunities, in terms of the knowledge, the transfer of skills, so that you can then facilitate a two-way flow. And that two-way flow is now going to change the locus of power from few or from the center to be more inclusive, to include the periphery. So that's the way I think you genuinely talk about reform to make the change we are talking about.
All right, I'm delighted to say that Prime Minister Motley is just on her way. So thank you so much for coming here and making the journey. And I think this may end up being the only panel that has been starting and finishing on time, despite people dropping in and out. So Dr. Ngozi, congratulations on that part. We have the last 5 minutes. Prime Minister Motley, thank you so much for joining us. Climate change, of course, an existential threat to some of these small island developing states. Barbados has been leading efforts to ensure that climate change adaptation is at the center of the global climate agenda. How can countries utilize trade to push this even further?
Well, I think to begin with, we all recognize that with what has happened in the last few years, we're seriously at risk of seeing declining economic growth because of the absence of a commitment to open and fair trade. You'll forgive me if my head is in the space of climate and health, because that's where I was this morning. And if we're going to talk about climate and health, the disparity in what has happened globally is perhaps most apparent and most recent in memory because of vaccine apartheid. If the trading system is to work fairly for all, then we have to start to deconstruct and look at the things that prohibit fair trade and free trade. And included in those is the need for a just industrial strategy that is just simply still missing. Not only is the financial system unfair and unrepresentative, but regrettably aspects of the capacity for countries to be able to ramp up from just being exploiters of raw commodities to being able to have greater value added, to have access to technology, and then to look and see how the trade rules can facilitate expanded markets. All of that needs to be done if we are going to ensure that there's equity across the board in terms of trade. I speak specifically of pharmaceuticals. As I said, we focus on vaccines, but let's talk about biologics. How many countries will be faced with the reality that biologics remain outside of their access and outside of their affordability? And unless, therefore, there is the deliberate attempt to create markets that will allow for South-South equity, we are unlikely to see any resolution of these matters. In addition to that, we have to remember that the absence of a development compact means that how much ever you want to provide for countries, if they do not have the institutional capacity or the human resource development, they're not going to be able to exploit. And that is why the Paris Pact for People and Planet, building on the Bridgetown Initiative, is so critical, because what it seeks to do is to provide a development compact which ought to have been put in place, regrettably, at the time of independence for most of the world's countries, but which was left excluded. And that is why the voice for reparations continues to go unabated, because you cannot simply say that you're going to preserve equality when in truth and in fact, the Aristotelian principles, Prime Minister Gonzalez was just referring to it again, of equality among equals and proportionality among unequals, has to inform the development compact if we are to ensure that countries can be brought up to speed in order then to benefit and to be able to participate fully in a fair global trading system. The failure to do that means that we're paying lip service to it and that we're not going to see countries be able to benefit from trade in the way in which they're supposed to. The last point that I want to make, of course, relates around the vexatious issue of intellectual property rights. And we have to be able to determine in a fair and sensible way how this is going to work. There are those who are on the front line and who believe that the exploitation of maximum intellectual property rights is obviously necessary to fuel investment, particularly in new areas of technology. And that's why Ngozi, your work and the President of Singapore's work and others become so critical now. Because unless there is clarity about global public goods, and I'm not referring to loss and damage alone, I'm referring to the full suite of global public goods. Unless we have a compact on what constitutes global public goods, and unless we secure the funding for global public goods, we're going to continue to have the disparity and regrettably allow those who have to continue to get more and those who have not to be victims of the rest of us who have. And I say so recognizing that you can't only maximize shareholder profits for goods that are necessary for the world and the people of the world to survive. And that there has to be some determination either in limiting the length of exploitative and exclusive use of licenses, or alternatively creating a public space in which all can benefit. The thing that sticks to the top of my head, as I said, is antimicrobial resistance. We are running around, pharmaceutical companies are producing everything else, but at the end of the day, the threat that is going to be greatest to the world's people by 2050 is antimicrobial resistance. And that's why there's a quadripartite effort to fix it. WHO, FAO, OIE, and UNEP. Now, if we know that, then we ought to create a safe place where the financing first of research can be done, because the economics of antibiotics does not work for pharmaceutical companies, and you can see it by their retreat from that space of research. In the year 2000, we had 20 companies. We now have 4 companies doing the research. And the consequences of not getting it right means that we're likely to reverse a century of medical progress, and going to the dentist or having a baby or getting your finger cut while gardening now becomes a life-threatening incident because of the declining effectiveness of antibiotics in treating these infections. All of us in here probably know people who have died from it, and hospital-acquired infections as well. But yet we are not making the decisions to create the space to avert what is really the silent slow motion pandemic. Now, the question as to whose intellectual property rights should be secured in that space, in my view, ought to be ignored, and that we should create a safe space for people to invest in that kind of research, but ensure that afterwards, if we are helping to finance it, then the public must also benefit from it, rather than privatizing the gains that will come from public subsidies in the research effort. And those are the kinds of conversations I think that we need to be having more and more. We need to see it with respect to technologies that will allow for greater distribution of water to people and communities, rather than privatizing the profits purely for those persons, particularly when in many instances state funds and international funds are going in to help companies be able to come to solutions. So I'll stop there.
But Prime Minister Motley, you're such a tour de force in climate change. So do you see trade as an enabler? Do you have to put almost trade, if you're going to achieve
Absolutely.
what you put?
Last year in Sharm el-Sheikh and in Glasgow, Ngozi will tell you that I spoke about, one, the need for a just industrial strategy, which is the prelude to having a fair trade system. Because you can't trade if you're not producing. If not, you just become victims of other people's production. And right now we are already market takers and not market shapers on so many things. But we need to be able to find a way that will allow us to be able to produce, even if only within our region. Ask the President of the Caribbean Development Bank how many countries in the region can have access to electric vehicles. Ask him what is our experience in terms of accessing batteries for battery storage. And more often than not, what you really see is that those at the top who can command production and command the purchase from the markets are getting what they need, and the rest of the countries of the world are waiting in a long line for if they can ever get 12 months, 24 months, 36 months supply chains. Doesn't work. And therefore our NDCs that we make here become a nonsense, because having said that we want to get to net zero, having said we're working to change the rules and the laws and to put the tax incentives in place, and you still don't get the plant or the equipment necessary. So something is dysfunctional. Until COP starts to focus on ensuring that capacity meets commitments, we're not going to get very far.
Thank you, Dr. Ngozi. Do you want to close up the session?
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion, and I want to say the coming and going has also brought richness in the discussion. But I want to close by picking up on the things that have just been said by the last set of panelists, starting with the minister from Finland, to Faike, to the Prime Minister, and to Jean. On one issue, I want to congratulate Finland on its long attempt for 30 years now to do the right thing and to see the benefits of trying to put some carbon pricing in place. I always tell people, as an economist, this is an instrument that we all think works, and I favor it more because I see that if we can get it right, some of those revenues should be going to developing countries to help them manage the just transition, if we can get a global agreement, and we absolutely need that. But also, we need to avoid the fragmented approach we have now. You know, you talked about prices varying from $1 in some places per CO2, per ton of CO2 to 130. You can't have a world with that kind of variation. We need to have some sensible approaches. But then, you know, the Faike also spoke of a very important issue. If we're going to try and harmonize approaches to carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets, to carbon pricing, we need this issue of certification of carbon credits is very important. And the comfort I wanted to tell you is that with this task force of international organizations that we've put together with the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the WTO, as well as some regional development banks that we hope will eventually join, and the UN, we need to be sure that developing country voices are represented. But my hope is that we'll be able to deal with this issue of how do we certify. Chancellor Schulz actually raised the same problem last week when we were in Germany, that the approaches are different. There is no credibility behind some of the credits. So that has to be something we fix. And then I do want to take up the development issue. It's interesting, Prime Minister Motley, that Jean was just speaking about that. You know, how to integrate and internalize the issue of development. We shouldn't forget that in trying to deal with the climate crisis, at the bottom of it is, how do we go green, but how do I put it, enhance living standards. One should not be, it's not a trade-off. We have to lift poverty, enhance people's living standards at the same time as we go green. And here trade is essential. And here is where what Prime Minister Motley is saying is critical. These diversification of global supply chains, this is the opportune moment to do it. Because as we see that at the WTO, we are calling it re-globalization. We are calling it re-globalization because we think it's a new way to reimagine globalization to benefit those who were left at the margin and to bring in those countries and geographies that didn't benefit in the first place. What does that mean? Now, instead of having 10 countries exporting 80% of the world's vaccines, which doesn't work in a pandemic, we need to decentralize production. At the same time we do that, we take care of public health, but we create jobs in those areas. Now that we need critical minerals, we'll do what my chief economist, Ralph Osser, who is here, says, why don't we look at our green comparative advantages? You know, we can all profit from countries doing what they are doing best, what they are green at. And trade can help make sure that we move things around the world so everyone benefits. So I sum up by saying that we cannot do it without trade. And the sooner we realize that we can make trade work to lift all of us out of poverty from developing countries, whilst also going green, the faster we'll be able to get to net zero. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the panel.